Actually, in graduate school, I was getting a degree in labor studies and began to see the real value of people who are going to be working side by side in an enterprise going forward. If they're on strike, if they're at war, how do they make that work? And usually productivity levels go way down after strikes. People have to come back to terms with the people who were dissing them and all that kind of business. So the more you can seek labor peace, the better off. So what forums would make that more likely? And during the Second World War, there was an effort in this country to prevent strikes because obviously the steel industry and whatever didn't want strikes. So they created in 23 states state boards of mediation. And these boards resolved all kinds of disputes before they led to strikes. And consequently, we began to see the real value of having mediators involved in these discussions because they can see some things the parties can't. You can usually test out an idea with a third party when the other one's not there. Because as soon as you test it out in front of the other guy, you've given it, So there are a lot of these little things that make it possible for people, and most people want to work things out anyway. They don't like strife, they don't like war, they don't like, So if you give them a forum that allows them to do it. And it was clear that the labor stuff had a lot more of a message than I think we were beginning to see. So I was getting a master's degree in labor studies, and then there was a course in public engagement and citing airports and things like that cause all kinds of angst in communities. And they were beginning to use mediation. I thought, well, this is kind of fascinating. So I concentrated on that, began doing it, actually doing some of the mediation, and then got involved with the Ford Foundation because my colleague who you just met, he was the program officer in charge of government and law. And he had been appointed to the Board of Governors by the governor, and I had been elected by the trustees. So we saw we had common ground in this dispute resolution stuff, so we decided to work together. And after Frank Thomas came into the Ford Foundation, he basically wanted to end the public interest law investment. He wanted to change a lot of things. So Sandy left. We formed a small center at NYU, considered to Columbia for a while, and then Rutgers made an offer, so we came to Rutgers. And we've been working on this for 30 years. The thing about Douglas, and the reason why, actually a number of my friends from high school also came to Douglas, which is sort of interesting, so we're able to compare and contrast our experiences over time. Have gone to a public high school, fairly diverse, and I ran for various offices. They always kept encouraging me to run for secretary. I didn't want to. And if I ran for president, then I lost, this sort of thing. So going to Douglas, although I don't think any of us thought we're heading to a women's college, we just knew Douglas was New Jersey and Douglas was well known and it was very competitive, and why not? So when we got here and began the experience of being totally our own selves, so to speak, and for some strange reason, I never quite figured out why, but I was nominated to run for president of the freshman class. Well, nobody knew anybody then. So how that happened, I have a feeling there was an upperclassman who must have gone to Nutley High School where I went, and so that happened. And I remember thinking, okay, I wanted to run for, here I am. And there was a sense that everything was possible. Every course that was offered was for us. It wasn't for them, but for all of us. And we thrived. I mean, it was an environment that really encouraged learning and aspiration and ambition. And in sometimes subtle ways and in sometimes very manifest ways. But for example, Dean Bunting was frequently talking about, don't just settle for a house in the oranges. This notion that somehow you go to college, you get a domestic kind of degree, and then you settle in and have children. No, this is not for you. You're at Douglas now. It got to a point where we would compare our SAT scores with the people going to Princeton and found ourselves higher and therefore, very, very elegant, all that. So over time, it became, this is the place we want to be. I think we were discouraged that the dean left, but then she went to Radcliffe, so that was okay. And Dean Adams was a remarkable woman. And fortunately for me, actually many years hence, I was on something called the Commission on Higher Education for the Middle States Association that did accrediting, and Ruth chaired the committee looking at Radcliffe College, and I was a member of the committee. So to be working alongside my former dean, this was really privileged, and she was an exceptional person to work with. I never thought that would ever be that. But there was always those kinds of experiences. So when I was acting dean and was speaking to the assembled at the chapel, I remember saying, and I said it out loud, there is no way that I ever thought when I was sitting down there where you are that I'd be up here. It was one of those wonderful moments, passed quickly because there were challenges and all that kind of thing, but lovely. So yeah, Douglas made a big difference for those of us who graduated from high school in that period of time. And I know Roberta Sigel and others have done studies about that cohort and their mothers and then their daughters. And I think it's a very, very rich subtext to take a look at. Can't clone myself, so I don't know what I would have been otherwise, but, you know, there was a sense that there was something afoot, you know, in the land. It wasn't just what was happening to us at Douglas. And also, we were very politically engaged. I went on a hunger strike because the French wouldn't get out of Algeria. You know, I mean, I remember all of these things that we were really motivated by, I mean, outraged by. And then when it became our thing, a woman's thing, and Friedan, and the conversations you'd have across generations, how disparate they were, how difficult they were, and yet you felt the gnawing of injustice, and, you know, but we didn't feel that we were experiencing that, and I don't think there was any antagonism toward Rutgers. We just thought, just stay over there. We're okay over here. Yeah, I think it was a good partnership. I think because when I was at Douglas, Rutgers was all male, so there was a kind of brother-sister relationship. I think in most cases the fraternity life and so forth, I didn't participate in much of that. But there was so much else beyond it. There were very few men in the classes. Occasionally there would be, but we kind of kept our distance. There was another subset that was looking for a Phi Beta Kappa. And it seemed as if it was an either or. And I think that became more confirmed with Betty Friedan's book. The sense that you had to make that choice and you couldn't have it both ways. I don't know that I actually thought about it precisely in that way, but I was married before my senior year, and I was going to graduate school. I don't think I thought either way about it. What was interesting is I make this point because I find it still offensive. I had, with all the other political science majors, and there were quite a few of us, we applied to the same institutions. I had the best grades. I was graduated with honors and whatnot. I didn't get in to Columbia, and I didn't get in. And my faculty advisors could not understand how could that be. I was the more qualified of everyone that we knew of, married, and that was assumed to be if you were married, you weren't going to be in for the long run, and they didn't want to give you a place. So that's fascinating, you know, that kind of discrimination that I guess nobody thought twice about. But so you're battling the cultural notions that you're supposed to be home now you're married and you're taken care of, and your own aspirations, and then the institutions reject you. So, I mean, I did a number of things, and I went to Seton Hall University that accepted me, and I did Chinese studies, and then I switched to American studies, and then I went to NYU and I did American studies there, and then I came back to Rutgers and I did labor studies, so I kept accumulating degrees. It's almost as if I was trying to put off being serious about anything. But
were you?
No, I just loved learning, so that was one thing. And I was also having kids, so, you know, you have two kids, 13 months apart, and then another one 7 years later does keep you occupied. But I was working around getting it all sort of in place. So the marriage fell apart, and I think a lot of it because of the strains and stresses of that period of time. I remember my husband telling me he was reading Marilyn French, and I absolutely couldn't get over it. It was his effort to try to find out what was going on in the world and in our little world. And I have to say, regretfully in many respects, that he was too far behind each time I was taking another step. Sounds kind of selfish. I don't mean it that way. It's just that you're part of that environment. I know who I am and what I wanted to be. I used to carry around my father's engineering books in high school. I think because somehow or another I wanted to identify with something that was different than other people. I still can't understand why I was doing that. That's just my guess at it. So I think I've always had a kind of compulsiveness. I've mentioned earlier about the fact that I write these columns for the Ledger. It's because when you feel strongly about something, either because you want to do it or because you think it needs to be done or to be said, you do it. So that kind of sort of some kind of spirit behind my involvements, I guess. There's a couple of reasons why. When I graduated, I remember thinking, well, I have to find something that's similar to the Student Center where you hang out and talk about politics and everything else. What would that be? And I found the League of Women Voters, a very similar group of people, a lot of women who were feeling strongly about things and acting accordingly. So one of the first things I got involved with, I became education chairman for the state board of the League, and there was a bond issue coming up, 1964. 65 it was passed, and I became very actively engaged in that, and Douglas was part of that struggle to get that bond issue passed. So while working with the Douglas people, I met the head of the Alumni Association, Adelaide Segorin, and she nominated me to be a member of the Board of Trustees. Douglas at that time had a couple of slots too, I believe, on the Board of Trustees. That's changed now, but she nominated me. A good example of someone deciding, here's someone who might be an up-and-comer, might be good for the college, and promoting me, as it were. And there have been enough instances of the other way, so I really appreciated that. And I began to be more involved in that way, kind of college, but League, back to higher education, and then involved, obviously, with the Board of Trustees, and then later to the Board of Governors. The trustees go back to the founding of the original Rutgers College, 1766. And when Rutgers became a public university, it was a land grant in 1860s, but became the public university in 1956. So we're very young as a university. And so the statute was written to retain the trustees because of the land and the endowment and a variety of other things. The trustees were not going to hand that over to the state. But they did agree to a governing board, which would be half appointed by the governor and then the other half elected by the trustees. So that's the way it's been since then until recent days. The trustees only really can have a role at all in the appointment of the president, and they control the land and some of the endowment, and some of their members are overseers of the foundation. Trustees serve on a lot of the same committees that the Board of Governors are on, so they kind of work side by side, everybody to the greater good of Rutgers.
Okay.
Well, one of the differences was I was a trustee at the time, and I had to keep it quiet because there was much acrimony between the very left-leaning people, some of them students, at the labor school, and I was a more mature student at the time, and but I also knew what was going on. So that made it kind of interesting. I sort of sometimes felt like I don't know, not a scab, but that I was placed in a place.
By the door, so to speak.
Yeah. So, but I loved it. I felt transformed by the learning. I didn't know, I had read about the early labor wars, and it was nothing that I had learned in high school, and basically nothing I had learned in college, really, except in American history, but only touched on it. But this was intensive. What was happening with the working people in this country? And I became seized by it, by the injustice, the unfairness, the deaths, and a number of the people affiliated with the college who had given money and named buildings were also part of that people group I didn't want to be part of. So it got very complicated. But what happened was I got an internship at Johnson & Johnson, spent some time there while negotiating labor agreements, so I got some real hands-on work. I then graduated, went to the State Board of Mediation that I had mentioned earlier, and did some work for them, and kind of moved around doing various consulting jobs, really, until I landed the Ford Foundation position, and from there went to NYU. And a lot of the Rutgers trustees were fit to be tied over the fact that they were forced to go co-ed and Douglas could stay single sex. I mean, that just, if it had been equivalent all along, they were comfortable with that. But the notion that that should change and Douglas would not be similarly penalized.
How did that happen?
You know, it's pretty interesting. I think the case was still made that there was a special reason why Douglas should remain female. But it was also the case that there was such demand for Rutgers that they had to satisfy the demand. And you couldn't expand Douglas, at least that's what was thought. And it was time for Rutgers to join the rest of the world. And I think it was beginning to be the situation where federal law and some constitutional challenges were also suggesting, you know, you're not on solid ground getting federal money and maintaining a separate institution. So Douglas was able to maintain its separateness, I think, in two ways. One, by being part of the umbrella of the university, and secondly, by basically claiming still a certain status that it was needing to make up for past deprivations, to put it that way. And it's been challenged a couple of times constitutionally. Every once in a while, a guy applies to Douglas and says, can't get in, got better SAT scores or whatever. And I don't know whether they're being put up by right-wing foundation or whatever. But so far, we have managed either to settle those cases or they just weren't brought further forward. And now I think we're at a similar juncture where we no longer have a faculty, where our status as a college is well, it needs to be better defined. So it's a residential college, but it still has significant intellectual, social, cultural, academic components. But how we project ourselves to the world, I think, is a challenge. And I think the strategic planning process has been attempting to address some of that. I think the question really is, if you are defending the notion or projecting the notion that women should be educated separately, what is it that you're doing for them in that setting that's different than they'd have somewhere else? I think a lot of it has to do with what the young women are doing in high school. So what kind of transition are they going to have here? So you find a number of young women who are fairly immature and naive or recent immigrants, and they thrive in a place like Douglas. Whether they would thrive similarly at Rutgers, I don't know. I'd really like to see those kinds of situations looked at pretty carefully. I do remember, going just back for a minute, that when the first reorganization was taking place in the late 70s, early 80s, and I was on the Board of Governors, and I voted against it, much to the chagrin of the president and everyone else.
Is this when the faculty?
Yes, when the faculty was taken away and consolidated. It was a strange period because faculty from Douglas and Rutgers would be on the same plane going out to recruit the same person, when we're part of the same institution. So there were these nutty things. But the fact is, the thought was that the faculties separate were not as strong as they would be together. And a lot of the faculty felt that was the case. Most of the Douglas faculty thought they should stay at Douglas. I think they had a special mission there and worried about what would happen. And I remember specifically saying to my colleagues on the Board of Governors, here's what I'm worried about. Douglas has more chemistry majors than any institution of higher education in the United States. and why they did not know they were going to major in chemistry when they came to Douglas. We've checked that out. So what is happening here that's leading them in that direction? And why do I pick chemistry? Simply because it stood out. So they can't major in physics because we don't have a physics department, and that's not good. So when we become one full faculty, they can have any discipline in any program, anything they want. But I'm worried about those chemists. And sure enough, after the consolidation slowly, that was no longer the case. I don't know what or why, and it could be explained by any number of things. But several of my colleagues, and then subsequent years, went on. One who wound up to be my own physician went from Douglas chemistry major to Harvard, and she was a physician and came back to be a physician at Rutgers. So those were the things I thought we were going to lose. And I wasn't sure precisely why we had those strengths. It had to do with the faculty recruiting the students, supporting them, believing in them, saying, you can achieve all these great things. Why couldn't that be in a consolidated faculty? The dean's...
Mary Hartman was the dean then, right?
Yes. She supported the consolidation. I did not. I've told Mary many times, we've been on the opposite sides of all these issues. You won, and I was right. Well, it's... She was in favor of getting rid of the State Department of Higher Education, too, when the governor in her wisdom decided to get rid of it. I was serving on it. I didn't think it was a very good idea. I said, Mary, you won again. You were wrong. I love her. So initially, there was such resistance to the consolidation of the colleges over decades, and there had been one study after another recommending there was something called the Federated Plan. There were going to be federated colleges. There was going to be this. There was going to be that. Finally, Ed Bloustein, he came in 71, and it was just as we were getting into the 80s, 79, 80, he said, enough already. This has got to change. We're going to consolidate the faculties. It was that vote that I voted against. It was the subsequent so-called TUE, Transformation of Undergraduate Education, that I was supportive of. And this was after I had been dean, and I saw what was happening in a college with no faculty, with the faculty fellows basically moribund, and with declining interest in students and enrolling. The profile of the students was shifting considerably. We wound up with almost a separate and unequal situation. It needed to be addressed, and I think effectively students were being hurt in the following ways. We were saying at Douglas, for example, you can only major in certain things here. Well, that was depriving women at Douglas from majoring in things over there. Why was that a strength? There was even an effort subsequently to try to make a difference. Why do we exist separately? So Douglas, you could major in whatever majors here, but you are required to have a minor in women's studies. I said, that's absurd. If you want to major in chemistry and minor in physics, you can't. You can't be forcing people's choices to explain why you exist. We have to get the benefits of the big and preserve the assets of the small. That's our challenge. And I think it was important to stop the fakery of college, because it really wasn't. And I think we were hurting students. For example, there were 4 or 5 different honor codes. If you had kids from all the colleges in the same lab and they were cheating, one might be expelled, another might have a hand slapped, and another something else. There were so many disparate things because the colleges were retaining all of their separate rules and regulations and expectations, but denying students a fair deal, basically, access to all the coursework, access to all the faculty, access. So it wasn't working. The idea of this consolidated faculties saving the colleges, they weren't being saved, it was hurting students. I saw that when I was dean, and I could see it clearly. So that's why I was willing to join the president's task force. This was President McCormick now. He asked us to take a look at what was happening, and it was scary. and not good for students. I always felt that if you keep the student in mind, you can make the best decisions. It's when you think about everybody's turf and this, that you get kind of messed up. But let's think about what they need. Now, the alumni, of course, were opposed. I thought they should be engaged in making a better outcome. I think that now, but I've not been persuasive. Reason for women's colleges, the reason for black colleges was because people were being denied access to quality education. So they came into being because people saw that that wasn't a good thing. But when you're created in reaction to something, I think that's one set of challenges. Now, when everybody ostensibly has access to everything, how do you maintain your separateness? How do you maintain the reason for being? I think that is really tough. And I think a lot of us seem to feel in our gut that there's good reason to do it. And there's not enough evidence, because when we look at the evidence, it's always the experience of women graduating from women's colleges when they couldn't go to Harvard and they couldn't go to Princeton and they couldn't go. So, but I think Cheryl Wall, who you may meet, her daughter chose to go to Spelman. And I remember Cheryl saying, I was really surprised at that. You might want to talk to her about that, because she would have thought in this day and age her daughter would aspire to another kind of institution. No, she wanted to go where she wanted to experience something she didn't think she'd experience somewhere else. So that's sort of an interesting thing. Now, I don't know how much may be happening at Douglas now where women are saying, you know what, we do have all these choices. We think we want to go there. What makes the there to them? What are they seeing? So at Douglas, I'd say, well, you can see you've got a certain set of internships. You have the Institute for Women's Leadership that gives you special privileges. Women at Rutgers have those too. I think the reason for being for women's colleges now is in the stages of full development. I think if you look at Wellesley, for example, there's an effort to have a strong presence component for professionalism. Come to Wellesley not only because you're going to get a broad, deep, profound, quality liberal arts education, but we are going to prepare you for the work life in ways that you're not going to get at a coeducational institution. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the pitch. I think it's generally that idea, that the notion that you're getting everything and a value added. So the value added is getting to know and love and live with women, to learn together in special housing, whether around a language or a culture or a global orientation. And it's about special programs, internships, connecting with alums, being part of a network that will stand you in good stead from this day forth, this kind of thing. But I think really it's still to be described and identified well. I think it's a real challenge as the colleges keep getting reduced in number. Those that are hanging on with a wonderful past, which I think justifies a future for them. But I think they need to better identify what they are, who they are, and what they offer. It's excellent, but you know what? I tried to do that when I was acting dean and got resisted at every level. No, everything has to be on our campus. And the interesting thing was this is what was happening with protect the college, preserve what we have, and don't let anybody off. Get the money, put all the money into the science building on the Douglas campus. And I remember saying to Dick McCormick, why are you celebrating all that money for the science facility on the Douglas campus? It's not equal to the science facilities on the Bush campus. Why shouldn't Douglas women take advantage of those labs, work with those faculty over there? I don't understand that. He said, well, no, you have to have something over there for themselves. I said, there's no such thing as a feminist chemistry. Let's understand what we're talking about here. You don't need to have your own if it's second class. You want first-class access, and we have to figure out how to do that and preserve Douglas. So I think one of the challenges is how do we preserve the Douglas presence and get involvement in the sciences that typically still don't interest women or appear to interest women, computer science, engineering. Create a space for them in the engineering school with special interest and support and whatnot and encouragement. Why don't we create our space there instead of trying to create them here? So that's what Jackie Litzman managed to do. And Tom Farris, who's dean of the engineering school, is 100% behind it. There's a real thrust to diversify the engineering school, and that's one sure way of doing it. So we are an asset, and we're beginning to be seen more as an asset in a lot of ways that typically before was, oh, they always want their way over there doing their thing, this kind of thing. But a lot of the innovations at Douglas have been adapted at Rutgers. And schools have been taken over. Mason Gross School of the Arts had its genesis at Douglas, and Roy Lichtenstein and the famous artist and Joan Snyder, who was in my class. Douglas had much to give to the university and still does. And so I think as long as it remains that asset and delivers on a future and attracts young women to its place, it'll thrive. I don't know about other women's colleges. It's going to be touch and go for many of them. We saw Sweetbriar go under and then come back. I've seen Mills over and back. You talk to people who've been at various other institutions, and they feel strongly that their Mount Holyoke is going to survive. But you notice a number of the women's colleges are having graduate programs for men, and they're doing various things to try to bring money in to survive. A lot of the original ones have huge endowments. That helps. But I think it's a really challenging time, and that's probably not strong enough a word. Who are we? What are we about now?
It's like an identity crisis.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's a sense that we know there's a reason to continue. That's why it's not just, we have an alumni association, we have to keep feeding. No, it's not that. We believe in what we had, and we want to share it. I mean, I was struck by the percentage in the early days of Douglas, the number of graduates, 50 some odd percent, were giving to the Alumni Association. That's very high. So that small cohort of women knew they had gotten something special and they were going to help the next generation. That continues. And I think there's a treasure, a precious jewel that college is, and we need to get it right. And I think a lot of people are working hard to do that. I look at it, I feel that language is just not up to the task. But I've just been exchanging messages with a friend of mine who just died 2 days ago, who was my classmate at Douglas. She went to work for the National Security Administration. She married a priest. She has 3 daughters that I have 3 daughters also, and we have been friends for the duration. And when I think about it, my classmates, there are 12 of us, now down to 10. We get together every year, several times a year. We have been there for one another for all the crises and challenges and wonders and joys of our lives. My daughters, who went to coeducational institutions, have none of that. So that level, that kind of connection, which we established there, again, we can't clone ourselves. How we would have been at Rutgers, I don't know. But that's very special. The regard for learning. When we come back for reunion, where's the intellectual content? Where are the faculty? This continued. All of these women went on to get graduate degrees or to do other things that built on the learning of their education at Douglas and their expectation of themselves. So there was a sense of what was expected of you, and you had to deliver, the connection you have with one another, and the belief that it was because of everything at that place, that special place, the women who came, the faculty who were there, the staff, the deans, the people who supported you, that was your life, and that made all the difference in what came later. I don't know whether that's a universal experience. I doubt that it
There were
is.
12 people in your class?
No, this 12, this cohort.
Your friends.
Yes. There must have been 100 and some
That's what I
odd.
was going to say.
Yeah.
I thought it was a larger.
But the reunion classes tend to be pretty big when they come back. I with the fissure with the Alumni Association now, it's very difficult because people are torn between the college and the Alumni Association when they should be all on the same page. The alumni have been very, very good at raising money. There's no question about it. They formed their own 501c3 right from the get-go. I'm sure they had no idea how important that would be going on. The law school did the same thing. But I think it has become too controlling an organization. When I became dean, and granted, I was acting and I was only going to be there for a year. I said, this is it. I was thrilled, but it was limited. I had my other life. The first person I thought would be thrilled would be the head of the Alumni Association, the first Douglas graduate to be dean, even though acting. I used to say acting, but serious. She said, well, what was her phrase? Well, we know you're a shill for the president. That was the greeting. So I was absolutely, it was like being kicked in the stomach. What? What? I mean, I couldn't understand it. The notion that somehow or another the president and the Board of Trustees or whoever was putting me into a spot to deliver something that I had no idea of was just nonsense. So it was a fraught relationship. I went to my first alumni board meeting to talk about what I wanted to do for the college with their support, and they told me the level of money they were giving my predecessor, and they were cutting it by $15,000 for me. So she got 50, you get 35. Why? I rattled off what I wanted, what I thought it was important to do, and they restored the money. But it was always this give and take. I think they had a staff of 26, I had a staff of 3. So there was a sense that all the resources were going to the Alumni Association, and then they were niggardly giving them back to the college. So if I said we need something for the Global Village, they would deliberate and let you know. So they were raising the money, but they were controlling the disbursement of it, and that was the problem.
So it becomes like a shadow.
Yeah. And I mean, I think basically they really mean well and cared about what they were doing, but their control was such that they didn't trust the deans, they didn't trust Rutgers. They thought every good thing from Douglas that became Rutgers was taken away from them rather than celebrated. So it was a mentality that's very hard to overcome. When I keep talking about Douglas as the jewel and the asset, I see it that way, and I think a number of people on the Rutgers side do. I think they also see that it's contentious and difficult, and I think a lot of that's driven by the Alumni Association. But I remember in my first couple of weeks as dean, what I would call the executive dean of FAS, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and say, I need money for X, Y, and Z. She'd say, get it from the Alumni Association. And when I'd say to the Alumni Association, I need money for this, they'd say, get it from Rutgers. So that you were constantly trying to navigate between those two worlds. Rutgers, or the FAS, was suffering for money, and they saw what the endowment was at Douglas and say, why aren't you getting the money from there? Why should we take it away from Livingston, who has none? Right. So these were difficult conversations to have. And I think people over time develop these antipathies, and some of them are well-grounded, some of them are not. But I think fundamentally, if you pressed anybody in Old Queens about the value of Douglas and its progeny, IWL, IRW, the Center for Women in Politics, they are constantly thrilled to be able to brag about it, and I think believe in it. Yeah, so that's right. I was not directly involved, but I know Mary launched the Institute to galvanize what she thought were elements of leadership to develop the potential. She ran into some early difficulties with Barbara Shaler, who thought that IWL should be for Douglas, not for Rutgers women.
Okay, Rebecca.
So you begin to see again this replay of, well, this should just be for us. Well, and Mary was beginning to raise money for IWL from the same sources that gave to the alumni. So Mary has a good relationship with the alumni, and she's kept that up for years. But I think there was always a bit of tension. You're raising something, and this is a good thing, and we like to support it, and we'll give you some money for it, but this should just be for Douglas women. That's not tenable. I mean, I think it's like economic protectionism. As soon as you begin to say, we're going to close this off, I think that's when you lose promise and you lose potential, even though there are downsides. If it was all Douglas, it would have been great strength for Douglas, but it would not have been good for all the women over at Rutgers, and I have to care about them too. There was an acting dean, Paula Brownlee. This is pretty interesting. These are the ways in which women help women, I think. I was on the trustees, or was I the governor? I guess, well, whatever. But I was on the Educational Planning and Policy Committee, which was the big, important Board of Governors committee. And Douglas Dean was leaving, Jewel Cobb, I believe, and then replaced by Paula Brownlee, acting position. And Ed Bloustein got the bright idea that the university could take over the house because Paula Brownlee didn't want to live in it, and maybe future deans wouldn't want to live in it, so we can repurpose that house. So I got living in the house a condition of employment for the dean. So that preserved that house. Now, I think it's central to, and I didn't even know that yet because I hadn't lived in the house yet, but it's central to the campus. It's the only dean that has a house. The president has a house, but the dean's house is right in the campus.
It was always so central to the social life of the school.
That's right. And depending on the dean, how she used it, but I had concerts in the house, I had lectures, we had student presentations, what their research projects were doing. We used the house for every reason, even more than the student center in a way. But I didn't even know and appreciate that fully. The notion that the building was going to be taken away and become Rutgers, that was not going to happen. So I think, being in critical places to run interference for things that are essential, very important. And sometimes you don't even know how important. I sort of thought sometimes I was a thorn in the side of the president, but those things do happen. He's one of the best presidents Rutgers has ever had. Bloustein, yeah, outstanding leader. But we had our differences from time to time. When you have taken in the view of the world about your sex, your gender, or your color, and you begin to see yourself as others see you, then you act in a discriminatory fashion toward your own. So sometimes it's called, I think I've seen all kinds of different expressions for it. Yes, in a way. I remember listening to some people talking about how they chose their doctors and so forth. Oh, well, I wouldn't go here, And these were people who were women who were not going to women. And I could think, what? Well, because they had been so conditioned to think this is not something women can do, so that they weren't going to go to that profession. I don't think they were doing that mental analysis, but I know at one point at Douglas, one of the things I had to wind up talking to my staff over and over again, you are thwarting the people below you, above you, because you don't want them to look good. The notion that you won't do your work because somebody above you is going to look good, where does this come from? And I found it astonishing. And I found myself at odds with a lot of, there was one staff member that I frankly couldn't understand what the antipathy was, particularly since I wasn't staying. And there had been an issue of the Kalian, which was the campus newspaper, and the young women, it was Breast Awareness Month, and so they had the cover of the Kalian, about 12 women, just naked from the neck down to the waist, breasts, no faces, breast awareness. She confiscated the entire issue, and when I found out, I had it put back immediately. And the students got wind that it had been taken away. They wanted to know who took it away, what about, they wanted to make a big thing about it. But I was mortified. I thought, what are you doing? And she was annoyed with me. I said, are you kidding me? First of all, I thought it was a great issue, but be that as it may. And I kind of ran up against some interesting challenges. For example, some issues of the Kalian would have these really outrageous views of naked or partially clad women, and I'd bring the students in and I'd say, what do you think you're accomplishing with that? Well, we're free, we can put anything we want in there. So you can. Where do you get those pictures from the internet? So some poor woman out in California is selling herself for a chip so you can put it in your Kalian? They weren't thinking that way, and it was the beginning of this kind of hooking up culture, and I wanted to have a series of serious meetings talking with them about who they are, how they want to use themselves and their bodies, and how they believe in it. Think seriously about what's going on here. And I got thwarted by a group of people who said, that's basically none of your business. This is all about other things we should be doing here. And I found that odd. Then I was thwarted by, I wanted to have a mediation program on the campus. I thought, this is a way in which you show how you can be powerful by helping rather than by asserting decision-making. And I was told, we have no problems. We have no conflicts. There's no need to have mediation. When I found a student had been living in her car for 6 weeks because she had a conflict with her roommate, I made the point, obviously, and this is the way I used to think anyway, that if Douglas had a mediation center and the young women here were trained to mediate on-campus conflicts, this would be an asset to the university. Anybody, anywhere in the university, students who had conflicts, roommate conflict, other kinds of things, can be mediated by these young women. Here would be a great asset, skill building, and, well, it didn't come to pass because everybody could think of all the reasons why it was hard to put together, including no money from the alumni to put it together. So, it was an interesting year. It started with the planes hitting the World Trade Center. And their parents were coming and taking their young women back from college because they thought that's what they should do. Everybody was kind of unsure what to do. Well, for me, it was bonding with the students. One of the students, her mother was a stewardess on the plane that went down in Washington. We had another student who, with her dog, went and helped cleaned up. There were students who didn't know where their parents were. I opened the house for people to stay. There were all these campus gatherings. You tried to come together as a community. And it was the launching of the year's Shaping a Life program. We made it about, survival and who we are as a community and what we want to be for one another. I think it was horrific, of course, but for the campus, it was something totally unanticipated, to be sure, but it had an effect that brought people even closer together. So in the dining halls, you could see everyone, instead of talking about their petty nonsense, talking about what's going on in the world, who we are, people. And it's funny because I remember specifically thinking about the Douglas experience when I went back to Morristown, where I live, and just happened to have dinner that week with a colleague of mine in an Arab Hamir restaurant run by Afghanistan residents. And so they had flags on the outside, and they were so afraid that people weren't going to come to the restaurant. And I didn't even put two and two together. And I went in to have dinner, and the mayor was there, and the police chief, and all kinds of residents had come to eat in the restaurant that night just to be supportive of local people who they felt might be retaliated against. There was the same kind of spirit and openness and generosity on the campus as well, to anybody who was wearing a habib, for anybody who looked like they might be different, who might be subject to any kind of hassle. And it was, the really good heart of Douglas, I thought. There wouldn't be a college without a faculty. And faculty made the decisions. Faculty were the lifeblood of the college. Without a faculty, how can you be a college? To me, it was just that simple. I didn't trust. I couldn't visualize how the departments were going to function with the colleges when they were consolidated. I thought they would be consumed with how they all got along with one another. I think it mattered if you were physically located in a place. So, you could walk over to American Studies. Now, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is because American Studies has its home base, Douglas, you probably have a lot of Douglas students who are majors in American Studies. I think there's a tendency to want to be part of what's close to you, which is also why the residential housing is so great, because you can be language and culture and all of that. But on the other hand, when you have to go over to the Bush campus for all your science and all that, I think that affects how you major. So that's why great to have the space in engineering, great to have all of that, because it tries to cross that bridge. But yes, I was not sure that it was going to work well for Douglas, and I thought, because I gave the example about the chemists, I thought that would be the death knell, for women in science at Douglas, and I might have over-exaggerated, but I was not comfortable with the plans going forward. The president was pretty sure about what he was ending, but I don't think he was that clear about what we were creating. And it took quite a while to get the act together. And I think in the meanwhile, Douglas was set back. Mary Hartman was the dean then, and she did support the consolidation. I think she expected more resources to be coming to Douglas. She tried to create a fellows program, basically keeping faculty attached to the college. And initially, that could work because they had been at Douglas and had been hired at Douglas. But once that cohort left, the rest are hired by their department. They have no affiliations with the colleges. You have to create that connection. So women's and gender studies, it's located on the Douglas campus. For good reason. And there's a great connection with the young women there, and that's appropriate. The religion department used to be there. I don't know whether it still is. I'm not sure where all the departments are. But I think I was concerned about all of that.
Right.
So I thought we could address the problems we had without consolidating the faculties, and I lost. But when it came time to revisit the question, how are we doing as consolidated faculty in separate colleges? Not well, and not just Douglas. Livingston was not doing very well. University College was beginning to get all kinds of students, for one reason or another, who didn't want to take any math classes, because it was supposed to be for students many years out of college, and we didn't seem to think it was appropriate to make them fulfill math requirements that many years removed. That didn't mean, let's go to University College when we avoid these things. So there was all this maneuvering around to get at what? At the heart of what an education should be? No, we should have core expectations. We should have a common understanding of what does it mean to be a Rutgers graduate. Let's identify that, let's get it together, and let's get on with it. Because really the consolidation did take place when the faculties were taken over. The second time around, it was really picking up the pieces and resorting them, but giving students more opportunities than they were having. Because what was happening is the colleges, to maintain the reason for their being, were keeping their majors reduced, were trying to keep the benefits that they had only to their own. It was fomenting all kinds of separateness that was not good, I think, for students who were trying to reach out and grow and take advantage of all the university had to offer. Why come here if you can only be over here? You want to major in journalism? Oh, you got to leave here and go over to Sky. Yeah. It made no sense. Yeah. We are one university, but Camden and Newark do not want to let go of the Rutgers name, but for all intents and purposes, they are of a size, at least Newark is, of a size and a comprehensiveness they could very well stand on their own. There were times in the past where the Newark campus of Rutgers thought seriously about becoming part of an all-Newark higher education establishment. It was called the Council of Higher Education Newark. That would have been brilliant for Newark and for Essex County, and I'm sorry that didn't happen, because separate institutions competing with one another, this is not great. But now the chancellors on both campuses, chomping at the bit, as it were, always thinking New Brunswick is keeping the money. Frankly, when I was on the Board of Governors, we were constantly asking for an assessment of how resources were distributed. We were persuaded that Newark and Camden were benefiting much more than their numbers justified, And that was justified anyway. But the fact that they were being deprived didn't seem fair, but they thought so. And this is the flagship. You can't get away from that. It's the heart of where the college was in 1766, Old Queens, College Avenue. You know, it has its own history and culture. I think you can't get away from that. But Newark and Camden are seen as real stars in the constellation. So where they'll be in the next 10, 15 years, I don't know. They've tried to consolidate the law schools. I don't think successfully. They're co-deans. How does that work? That's a great question. When I talked about the opening of crossing the threshold of opportunity coming to this women's college, that was true intellectually and to a certain extent socially, except that you had to be in your dorm by 10 o'clock at night, and don't try sneaking in. You had to, no drinking, no smoke. Well, no, that's right. You could smoke, but not in the dorm, not in our little dorms on the Corwin campus. At that time, we were still hawking cigarettes on campus for a few extra bucks, you know, that kind of thing. Oh, when I think of those days, my gosh, now we're doing with Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Anyway, the chapel was required. You had to, oh, yes, and as a first-year student, you could not wear red. I'll tell you a quick story. I was on a blind date, half blind. I had met the guy on a mixer at the Douglas campus. He was at Princeton. And the deal was at Princeton, they had like rooms where 3 or 4 guys had different rooms in a little kitchen type thing. And so if you went to stay, you know, you had your own room and all this stuff. So I go down there, and I go to the room, and it's a single. So I thought, oh, God. And on the wall was a moose hanging. And from this moose was a little sign that said, "You think you're horny." I thought, oh, all right, I'm out of here. So, but how do I get out? How do I escape? This, by the way, I'm all dressed for the dance that night in my red dress. So I got to get back to the campus. And how do I get on the campus? I'm wearing a red. You can't wear red if anybody sees me with red. This is going to be bad. Well,
what would happen if you wore red?
Well, you get penalties and whatever else. But, you know, it was verboten, so, you know, you didn't do it. And I guess I was intimidated. But I think I was pretty good to get out of that place. But I had no way to get back. The buses weren't running anymore. So a guy at a gas station offered to drive me back to campus. Can you believe it? In those days, I guess that was fine. And he did. And he lent me his jacket so I could cover up my red dress. Now I remember that. And so we lived in this environment of things where you had to be sure you didn't make some mistake. And there was an honor board. And in fact, I served on the honor board. And here's a good example. Oh, this is a great example. It came to pass that a student was being penalized. She was coming before the honor board, and I forget whether she was going to be expelled or she was going to be suspended because she had spent the night with a Rutgers guy. So the issue was she out of the room without permission, whether it's not. So I remember as the honor board, I said, "What happened to the Rutgers guy?" "Oh no, they don't have similar rules over there. This only applies to Douglas," and. Well, that struck me as grossly unfair, so I refused to convict. And the dean of students was livid with me. So we had a contentious discussion, and she said, you know, we have a rule here. You are not allowed to bring discredit on the name of the college. You see, it's written right here, number 10 or whatever it was. I said, bring discredit on the name of the college? So if I steal a towel from a hotel, am I bringing discredit on the name of the college? She said, it doesn't go that far. But supposing the reputation of Douglas gets around that young women go and spend the night with Rutgers people, I said, well, that might attract them to come, for all I know. That didn't sit well.
I'm sure.
But yeah, there were a lot of constraints. And you had to wear a skirt to dinner. So in the old Cooper dining hall, you would see, it's no longer standing, this rack of hooks with all these grotesque, long, ugly skirts. We'd all leave them there. We'd go in there, put the skirt on, and then go into dinner, come out, take it off, and go back in our jeans. And we had prayer at at dinner. Somebody rang a bell and you said a prayer.
Christian prayers.
Yeah, I guess. I think they were silent, but I don't recall that. And the food was not good. And if you didn't like the main dish, you could have cheese, and it was 3 pieces of American cheese on a plate. I ate more pieces of cheese, I think one particular, I think that's why I got so sick and I went into the infirmary, and they wouldn't let me out. But I had to be at a demonstration, I thought. So then I refused to eat altogether. So I was on a hunger strike until my father showed up. When he crossed the threshold, I thought, ooh, I'm in trouble. But as I said, the French wouldn't get out of Algeria, and I had to get out of that infirmary.
How diverse was your class, though?
Fairly diverse, yeah. My godchild, Joy Smythe Macaulay Zollner, came from Sierra Leone, and she was just great. So I always think of Joy because she was one of our crowd. There were young women from Catholic school, so they were sort of a kind of a cohort. There was a reasonable number of, you probably have heard all of the stories about anti-Semitism at Douglas, but basically it was rampant in higher education, generally speaking. But there were people of every faith, religion, ethnicity, the sense of being a real cultural mix. And as I said, at my high school, it was very diverse. So I was used to that. I always had friends who were Black, Jewish, French, whatever. It just was who we were. Same community I live in now, Morristown. I don't think I want to live in any other place. And that was the way Douglas was. I think it probably not as diverse as it now is. I think there are more Asian students now and more Middle Eastern students, I believe. But I don't really know. I think more higher education is more diverse, generally speaking, than those days. But we probably, compared to other colleges at the time, probably remarkably so. The path that goes from the street, George Street, where the Douglas sign is, Douglas College, going up to College Hall, that's called Sacred Path. And as a first-year student, you were not allowed to walk on that path. So, the big thing is when you become a sophomore, you can walk on that path. Because otherwise you have to go around. Right. I think most of us just walked alongside of it, on the grass because, well, what the hell. But yeah, there were a lot of things like that, traditions, and they still have them in one way, shape, or form. Not exactly the heart of the activity, I don't think, any longer. But they still resonate for those of us who were there then.
Well,
I just say one more thing,
sure.
And that is that in all the talks I had with alums during the last reorganization, I tried to make the point that Douglas has changed. And you know that expression, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose? Each generation benefited from it, and it was different for each of us. And what we're trying to preserve is often the thing that we had. But the next one was something different, and the one before that was something else, and it was good for them then and there. The statistic nationally is that 80-some-odd% of students love the choice they made for college because they make it work. And that's as simple as that, because they're so crazy, the reasons people choose where they go. But most of us didn't know that we were making an affirmative decision to go to a women's college and to go to Douglas. And I think that's only really in recent decades that that's been the case. We came because we couldn't go elsewhere, but we profited from it. But the sense of the Douglas experience, the Douglas difference, or what I call the Douglas advantage, is that it changed enough to accommodate the people who were coming at that period and made it work for them, and they made it work for themselves. So the reason that we continue to thrive is because it has an adaptability. Even though I can't describe precisely what it is, it's an animus, and it's a spirit, and it's an involvement, and it's an engagement that makes a difference in people's lives. And maybe they go there because they're going to do that anyway.